Hello. So let's have a look at virtue ethics applied to the issues of animal ethics. This is not Christianity, this is ethics year one content. Sometimes I do find that people get quite anxious about applying virtue ethics. I think I've probably said this before in another video. Don't stress too much about it. Just remember that it's not going to be the same as natural moral law and situation ethics. You haven't really got a very, very clear framework to work off of. But you just have to think a little bit more broadly through it. And I'll return to this later, but my best advice when you're applying virtue ethics to anything is just to think what virtues would be in play on this issue. What virtues, what vices? Sometimes it will just be one or two, sometimes it will be lots. So I'll take you through this and I'll try and draw out for you how you could apply it. So a particular question I want to think about, which might be useful for AO2 for your 15 markers, is about whether what Aristotle said about animals is still valid today. How far can we rely on virtue ethics as being appropriate for the 21st century? Okay, so let's start with what we know. Aristotle wrote bits and pieces about the relative values of humans and animals. So we know that he believed in the hierarchy of souls, which Aquinas then went on to borrow and incorporate into natural moral law. So just to remind you of what that is, it's the idea that humans are at the top of the hierarchy. Next is animals, next is plants. And plants feed animals, and then plants and animals feed humans, but humans are at the top. He believed that all things had a final end. So if you've had a look at Aristotle's function argument, which you won't be asked about in the exam, but it's worth knowing something about it, this is kind of what that is, a reason that governs its existence. So for humans, their final end is eudaimonia. But it can't be that for animals because animals don't have reason. So their final end can't be eudaimonia. It has to be something else. So maybe the final end of a lion is just to kind of be the best lion it can be. But that's not the same as a human being the best human that it can be. So by that logic, it doesn't make sense to treat animals in the same way that we would treat humans or to see them as the same as humans. And another thing we know about Aristotle is that he did do some animal studies of his own. He dissected animals. So this suggests that to him, experimenting on animals wouldn't necessarily pose a huge problem because probably in quite a small way, he did do it himself. Okay, a couple of virtues and vices that are very much worth thinking about when we're thinking about the animal issues. The first kind of pair of virtues and vices that I want to talk about is compassion versus callousness. So compassion is the virtue, callousness is the vice. So just to define that for you, compassion is where you look at suffering and you feel moved by it and you want to help and you want to alleviate that suffering. Callousness is when you look at suffering and you don't really care. So a person's attitude to animals based on their character, based on whether they have a compassionate character or more of a callous character, will have a big impact on how animals are treated because that will affect how you react to what you see when you're thinking about animals suffering or animals being used by humans. And then courage and cowardice. Courage is bravery. Cowardice is being a coward, being scared. In this context, we could say kind of maybe scared to do the right thing. So the way this applies is, are we going to be brave enough to embrace new thinking about the uses of animals? Is it brave to perhaps push on from what we've always done and do something new? But there's different kinds of bravery, there's different kinds of courage. So you could say that a matador who baits bulls, who winds up bulls so that they're violent and angry and attack the matador, and then the matador kills them, which is basically how bullfighting works. In some cultures, that is done for entertainment. And you could argue that the matador is brave, but are they really brave? Because they do not have to put themselves into that situation. It's totally for human entertainment, for those who like that sort of thing. So I just want you to think a little bit more broadly about courage doesn't always look the same in every situation. Right, let's talk about intensive farming. So intensive farming, as you probably know, is about producing lots and lots of crops, or in this case, lots and lots of animals, very intensely, very quickly, often keeping the animals in very bad conditions. So on one level, this is about eating meat, and Aristotle very unlikely to have had a problem with that, because animals are lower than humans in the hierarchy of souls. So this suggests that part of their final end is to meet the needs of humans. And meat eating would have been very, very normalized in Aristotle's society. But what they didn't do in Aristotle's society was farm intensively. So we don't know what he would have thought of this because he wouldn't have seen it. But intensive farming generally is not good for animals. They can be kept in very, very bad conditions, often in pain. You know, there's cases of chickens who spend their whole lives in cages and they never see the light of day. And, you know, the animals who are farmed intensively are often killed with very little regard to whether or not that's humane. And it's all about profit. So my last point here, can it really be argued that anyone's character is made more virtuous by such an industry? People who defend intensive farming would say, well, people want food to be cheap, they want food to be affordable, they want there to be a lot of it. So we have to do what we have to do to bring that about. Yes, but is anyone made more virtuous by doing that? Or is it just all about profit and convenience, which you could argue are not really the same thing as being virtuous? So it's hard to argue that intensive farming is virtuous, because if we're thinking about profit and just what's convenient to us, that's more in the area of vices than virtues. To be virtuous, we'd be thinking more about the welfare of animals. Compassion is a virtue, but if you're really compassionate, you can't compartmentalize that. So what I mean there is you can't truly be compassionate if you care about the suffering of humans, but not about the suffering of animals. Surely if you're truly compassionate, you're compassionate to any beings that are suffering. And you don't switch that on and off depending on whether it's a chicken or a person. Compassion is compassion across the board. Okay, let's have a look at scientific procedures and cloning. Now, this is way, way, way on from anything Aristotle would have been aware of. So we have to dig into what he did and then try and apply it in a modern sense, which is not always easy, but we'll have a go. So we know Aristotle experimented using animals. So simply doing experiments, probably not that controversial to him. He really, really valued intellect. He concludes in his ethics that theoria, so scientific intellectual contemplation, was the greatest expression of human reason. And so if using animals could advance human intellect, he probably wouldn't have had too much of a problem with that. But again, compassion's important. Compassion for the creatures being used. Is pain being controlled? Is suffering being minimized? Are things happening to communicate between different scientists doing this work to check that experiments aren't being duplicated and suffering's therefore being duplicated too? So this depends on all researchers being virtuous. And some, unfortunately, simply don't care about the animals that they use. Some do, but we can't guarantee that. Now, Rosalind Hursthouse, who's a modern virtue ethicist, looks at this issue kind of in the round and concludes that overall, the suffering that's caused is probably disproportionate to the good that is done. So yeah, sometimes we do have breakthroughs. We do have times when using animals in scientific procedures, cloning animals, using animals in that way really benefits humans. But there's also thousands, millions of animal lives that are taken, and also those are very painful lives of suffering that don't get us anywhere. Okay, let's have a look at blood sports. So we've got a nice picture of a bull and a matador there. Hunting would have been very normal for the ancient Greeks, so Aristotle would have been aware of hunting, and it was a source of food. It was probably more done as a source of food than as a source of entertainment, and that has shifted slightly in modern times. Now, straight away, you could go straight in and say people who take part in blood sports are callous rather than compassionate, so they're demonstrating a vice, not a virtue. It doesn't feel right to a virtuous person that someone could enjoy the suffering of an animal. So remember, with blood sports, animals are suffering, and that's kind of the point of the entertainment. So whether it's blood sport, whether it's bullfighting or fox hunting or whatever it is, the point is to kill the animal, and that's where the fun comes from. Many people today find that quite distasteful, and if we're looking at it from a virtuous point of view, it's hard to see much that could be virtuous about that kind of approach. Now, you could argue that the matador is courageous, but two things there. Firstly, it's calculated, so it's not the same kind of bravery as a soldier who puts themselves in harm's way, because the matador knows that he will almost certainly win. He is trained, he has systems in place if something goes wrong, and he's done this lots of times before. Also, he does not need to be there. It is not a matter of enormous importance that he does this. It's for entertainment, and you can't say that about the soldier. So there are lots of ways to demonstrate human skill and courage that don't harm animals in any way. So blood sports don't seem to be virtuous. In other words, if you want to show off your physical prowess, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of ways to do that. There are tons and tons of other sports. Why do you need to hurt animals? And then finally, animals as a source of organs for transplant. Again, not something that would have been on Aristotle's radar at all. He approved of scientific research and advancement in a very appropriate way of his time. He wouldn't have known anything about what we can do today. You could argue, again, going back to compassion, it's compassionate to perform procedures to save or improve human lives. If we can make human lives better, we should. On the other hand, it could be considered callous to exploit animals for their organs, and also callous to ignore the views of those in society who value animal lives highly. So in Aristotle's thinking, yes, you do put humans first, but do you put humans first at all costs? That's a bigger question. And then a final thought, is being virtuous just about how we treat other people? Or is it about how we view creation as a whole, creation for want of a better word, animals and the environment? Is it okay to be more compassionate towards humans than animals? Or does this show that if you do this, then you're not really compassionate at all? There isn't a clear answer to that. You've got to make up your own mind. And when you're applying Aristotle's views to these issues, remember that we really don't know very much about what he would have thought about them. So it's okay to theorize a little bit. It's okay to say, well, he said this, so maybe he would have thought that, or perhaps it could go the other way. The examiners like to see you doing that because it shows that you're thinking. It's better to show evidence of thought than it is of just having learnt a bunch of stuff off a video or off a book and then regurgitating it. Don't be scared of thinking. All right, that's it for this video. Hope you have a happy new year, and I'll talk to you soon.